Okay, so capitalism. Brilliant, thanks. I'm not going to tell you much about myself. I think Felix has just done a very flattering introduction for me on that one. So I'm going to skip with that first of all, and we'll come back to a little bit more about me and what I do a little bit later on in the talk. But first of all, really what I wanted to do to start with was introduce Ben Geary, who's given one of the other talks in the series so far. And he's going to be making occasional appearances in this talk as well. And he's just going to share a little tale with us before we go any further. So Ben, can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, I hope everyone can hear me as well. The classic Zoom refrain. The Fisherman and the Businessman by Paulo Coelho. There was once a businessman who was sitting by the beach in a small Brazilian village. As he sat, he saw a Brazilian fisherman rowing a small boat towards the shore, having caught quite a few big fish. The businessman was impressed and asked the fisherman, "How long does it take you to catch so many fish?" The fisherman replied, "Oh, just a short while." "Then why don't you stay longer at sea and catch even more?" The businessman was astonished. "This is enough to feed my whole family," the fisherman said. The businessman then asked, "So, what do you do for the rest of the day?" The fisherman replied, "Well, I usually wake up early in the morning, go out to sea and catch a few fish, then go back, play with my kids. In the afternoon, I take a nap with my wife. Evening comes, I join my buddies in the village for a drink. We play guitar, sing, dance throughout the night." The businessman offered a suggestion to the fisherman. "I have a PhD in business management. I could help you to become a more successful person. From now on, you should spend more time at sea and try to catch as many fish as possible. When you've saved enough money, you could buy a bigger boat and catch even more fish. Soon, you will be able to afford to buy more boats, set up your own company, your own production plant for canned food and distribution network. By then, you will have moved out of this village and to Sao Paulo, where you can set up HQ to manage your other branches." The fisherman continues, "And after that," the businessman laughs heartily, "after that, you can live like a king in your own house, and when the time is right, you can go public and float your shares in the stock exchange, and you will be rich." The fisherman asks, "And after that?" The businessman says, "After that, you can finally retire, you can move to a house, buy the fishing village, wake up early in the morning, catch a few fish, return home to play with the kids, have a nice afternoon nap with your wife, and when evening comes, you can join your buddies for a drink, play the guitar, sing, and dance throughout the night." The fisherman was puzzled. "Isn't that what I'm doing now?"
Thank you for that, Ben. We'll come back to that in a little while. So first of all, I'm going to mainly be talking about the practice, I think, of environmental archaeology today, rather than looking at capitalism in what we find as environmental archaeologists. So a brief run through of what we're going to have in the presentation is a quick look at the system that we work within. I'm going to look at some definitions and how they're particularly relevant to what I want to talk about today, which is going to be centered around how archaeology is valued, but also around our values that we hold as environmental archaeologists. I'm going to look a little bit then about how we start to bring those values into our work. And for that, I've got two case studies. So there'll be a short film with an interview with Liz Pearson, who's an archaeobotanist in that too. And then that should bring us back round. So we should start off, first of all, with the term capitalism, I suppose. We can't really avoid it. We now live primarily in a capitalist world. Capitalism is often thought of as an economic system in which private actors own and control property in accord with their interests. Demand and supply freely set prices in markets in a way that can serve the best interests of society. And that's a quote from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And I think really the essential point in that is that the main feature of capitalism is the motive to make a profit. But for me, I think there's a few things that come through in capitalism, and it's very much that it's a system that's defined as being linear, as progressive, with a sense of development within it. And really there is this idea that we keep on developing, we keep growing. And that's what I kind of sits uncomfortably, I suppose, a little bit with me. The other previous or other economic systems that have sat alongside capitalism before, the main one being socialism. But I think now we're starting to also get other things coming through, which I'm sure people are aware of, things like the circular economy or this whole idea of donut economics too. But without going too much into the economic side of things, that's kind of a tangent. And I've had to really try and keep myself on something linear for this presentation, but I keep wanting to go off into these side sheets, and that's definitely one of them. But really that's just to kind of give you a feel for kind of where we are at the moment. And as I say, really as commercial archaeologists, developer funded research is embedded within this capitalist society. But more to the point, developer funded research continues to thrive and pay the salaries of the majority of environmental archaeologists working in the profession. And that's a quote from Andy Howard, who is a geoarchaeologist. And so even if we don't hold those principles as dear to our own hearts, which some people may do as well, but even if you don't like it or not, a lot of us are working within that system. But the people who are working in that developer funded sector, in the UK, this tends to be private companies and individuals, and I could probably count myself as one of them in that I'm a freelance trader in the way that I've set up my business. But then there are also county councils, university units, and museums. And I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that this works slightly differently to in Norway, where it's mainly the 5 university museums, NICU and the maritime museums, who are the groups that undertake the archaeology. I'm not aware of any private companies or individuals working there, but there may well be, and I'd really love to hear about that. So if you know of any, if you pop those in the chat, that would be great, because it would be nice to know that for sure, really. So even if we are working within one of those agencies which doesn't necessarily have profit as one of its main targets, the types of projects that we're working on are often concerned with development and growth. They could be housing projects for building new housing. They could be large infrastructure projects. In the UK at the moment, there's quite a controversial project, HS2, building the high-speed train network between London and Birmingham. And a lot of archaeology and archaeologists are taking part in that. At the moment, I'm not, but it's one of those things that raises an interesting question with me, is that actually, if I am asked to do work on it, how does that sit with me and my beliefs too? Because one of the other sides of that project is that an awful lot of ancient woodland has been destroyed in order to build that. So again, even if we're not necessarily involved in it directly in terms of setting these projects, we're often cogs in the wheel, and even those cogs in the wheel, there is a political side to that. This is all part of a very much larger political web, and even if we don't necessarily acknowledge that, it's still there as an undercurrent below too. Leaving that aside though, I was just going to have a quick look at some definitions. One of the main things that keeps coming up when I've been looking into this has been the term work. It's something that we often talk about. I'm going to work, this is what I do for my work. It's there a lot, but actually what does that term work mean? So David Frayne has written a really lovely book, which I have actually right next to me. I don't know if anyone can see this, but it's called The Refusal of Work. I would thoroughly recommend it as a good book to have a look at. But he talks about how work has been defined by different people and different times. And I just want to go through some of the ways in which he points this out. So one of them is looking at Marx's definition, and he says that work is a defining activity of humanity, and that's really an ability to conceive of and craft a world of artificial objects. So thinking about that thing of craft, we also have artists, and And for an artist, when artists talk about their work, often they're talking about it as a way of embodying their talents. There's also possibly an idea around, is it a quest for immortality as well? If architecture is around designing bridges or churches, for instance, these types of large monuments that are going to be around for a while, or if someone writes a book, that's going to be around as well for hopefully a lot longer after someone's no longer with us. So we've got two quite different definitions there already. A third one really is those people who are work in repetitive or perhaps menial work, and they can sometimes come to regard work as a burden, a slog, or a grind. It's something to be gotten through to get to the end of the day when you can actually start living your life. It's not necessarily seen as something positive, but something as necessary. And another category as well that I find quite interesting is an idea of, well, what is proper work? And there are large groups of society who are often being productive in some way. For instance, it could be domestic work at home. Some artistic and intellectual work is often seen as this, or care work, but it doesn't necessarily have any monetary value attached to it. But does that mean that it's still, or does that mean it's not work? This group of people often sits on the fringes of society as well. And it kind of brings up the question, or the wider question of, well, which activity or activities does society choose to allow into the category of proper work? And does this change over time? And do we need to rethink about redefining this as well? And then I suppose that then leads on to this question of a work-life balance, which is a term that again comes up an awful lot and has done, I suppose, over the last 20 years. Is it really as simple as having either work in your life or having your life happening, or is it more complicated than that? Inevitably, it's bound to be. But a definition of work-life balance has been defined where an individual is thought to have sufficient control and autonomy over where, when, and how they work to enable them to fulfill responsibilities both inside and outside of paid work. Now, inevitably, there has been quite a lot of criticism of this term work-life balance. And just some of these are that, can we really make a clear distinction, like I was saying before, between work and life? Is balance even possible, or is it even desirable, I suppose, is the next part of that. Should it be equal? Should we allocate equal time to each of these domains, or what should that balance be? And also, is it possible to achieve a right balance? Because during your lifetime, things will shift and change. Another criticism as well that I've not put on here is that quite often when people talk about having a work-life balance, the life side of it is often seen to be around families. So you're balancing your work and your family, but there have been studies done as well around single professionals, for instance, and their need for a work-life balance too, but feeling like they don't perhaps have as much right to it. So there's all sorts of things around social justice in here too. There's another quite long quote, but I am going to read it because I think it actually summarizes quite a lot of it. And it just says that the term work-life balance really has been co-opted by management. Work-life balance represents yet another example of capitalism's remarkable ability to take a potentially radical idea, soften it up, and serve it back to us in the interests of commercial gain. The failing of the work-life balance rhetoric is that it does not ask fundamental questions about what the purpose of work is, nor does it question work's ability to fulfill societal functions. It only gives us permission to ask quietly that we be allowed to ask a little bit less, usually to pursue other responsibilities, such as taking care of our families. And again, there's a huge amount in there, but just this idea even of something that is trying to go against work, which has huge amounts tied up with their idea of capitalism and work for creating gain, really, then that's kind of been co-opted back by capitalism as well. Oh, there's all sorts of kind of circular loops in those arguments. But I think, again, we need to just rethink that dichotomy. And I suppose the other bit that really comes through to me in all of this is it is a dichotomy, and it, for me, bears quite a similar or it bears a resemblance to the same arguments that we have around nature and culture, that quite often these things can be useful in that they're set up as a divide, not necessarily to keep that, but at least for defining one and the other. But reality often exists in some sort of intermingling of the two. So really what I wanted to try and do is to go back to that work-life balance thing, is to try and leave that to one side and actually go, okay, well, what are our values and what do we bring of our values into work and into life? So that then inevitably then leads on to more definitions of well, what are values and what does it mean to be valued as well? So just a couple of, again, brief definitions here. Values are generally the principles that help you decide what is right and what is wrong and how to act in various situations. Whereas valued is what is considered to be important or good. So as Felix has mentioned, some of the work that I've done has been looking at the relevance of particularly environmental archaeology to wider society. And it's quite interesting actually thinking about those words relevance and valued. And although they are very different, I think there's definitely points of similarity in them. So what I just want to have a look at very briefly now, the talk isn't going to focus on this, but I think it's useful to bring these in, is just thinking about how is environmental archaeology valued? And an article that came out a couple of years ago now by myself, Daryl Stump and Rob Marchant, we looked at this based on a project that I'll talk about in a second. But what we really said to start with is that basically environmental change, environmental archaeology can help you chart environmental change through time. And that has to really be a starting point. And a lot of people assert that it has that has relevance, and it has relevance to questions of sustainability, climate change, soil health, food security, and there are some really wonderful studies that do demonstrate this, and there's a couple of those just there that are mentioned. So the project that I was working on with Daryl Stump, who was the PI on that project, was the archaeology of agricultural resilience in Eastern Africa. And this really was looking at the applicability of environmental archaeology to agricultural sustainability today. But generally, we found that for archaeology to be considered in the conversation at all, we had to phrase what we were talking about in terms that were understandable to the audiences we were talking to. And in this case, we were trying to talk to NGOs, policymakers. They're all very big terms, big groups of people in themselves. But ultimately, it wasn't archaeologists. We didn't need to convince archaeologists about any relevance to this, but actually an entirely different group of people. So as part of that, we came up with a policy brief. Again, it's not really something that you would necessarily come across within the archaeological world, of creating a brief that could go out into the wider circles of decision making. And we tried to look at the language and concepts of how we express that. And I've just taken two of the recommendations here and I've just popped them up on a slide. I'm not going to read them out, but what I am going to do is just show you some of the, highlight some of the words in there. And again, one of the things that really shines through is that the language and concepts that we used in that was very much from a capitalist world. And I think that that comes through quite clearly. We're talking about cost benefit analysis. We're talking about quantifying trade-offs. We talk about development schemes. And again, there's this idea of development, of linear progress. So I suppose what this is illustrating really is that two things. One is that in order to try and talk to a different audience, we have to be willing to rethink how we think about and talk about and ultimately communicate archaeology, and especially environmental archaeology, but also from thinking about it in terms of it being embedded in this wider capitalist world. I think also it really raises the point there of actually how much of the rest of the world is in that structure, and how much we need to kind of think about how much we want to think about our ability to engage with that and our desire to as well. Now I've just clicked on to Ben's slide, so I'm going to bring Ben in here because I don't know about this bit. So this bit will be new to me as well. So I'll hand over to Ben for a minute or two.
Okay, thank you, Susie. Really to kind of pick up, I suppose, with what Susie's talking about, and also to, I think, link back to something that I alluded to in my talk a few weeks ago. Are we always bound to think of value within essentially frameworks that always end up being, I suppose, capitalist? Is there any way we can kind of think of value differently? So perhaps if we think an expression of something that I mentioned in my talk, and again, myself and Susie and other colleagues have talked about this, is what about other forms of value? So perhaps the idea of ephemeral value. And okay, if you go on the internet and look for definitions of ephemeral value, here's one from the Society of American Archivists, who define ephemeral value as value that is useful or significant for a limited period of time. And note that records of ephemeral value, such as transitory records, are often scheduled to be destroyed after use. So I suppose within that definition of ephemerality is something that is passing and essentially is destroyed. But can we think of the value of some of the work we carry out as essentially being the ephemeral value of something that celebrates that fact? Something that, if you like, deliberately and gleefully escapes attempts to measure or to cost, I suppose. We are bound within our practices naturally to be tied into frameworks of value and metrics. Again, for those of the academics in particularly the UK, suppose-based academics, frameworks such as the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, we are tied to these articulations of value by the work that we do. And perhaps to an extent that always means we are chasing and constantly on a treadmill to demonstrate our value. But can we think in other ways? Can we think of some of the engagements that perhaps we carry out or engage in that move away from that idea? If you could click the image, please, Susan. An image should appear. So again, this is, when I was thinking about this earlier, this is, some of you may recognise, this is a colleague here at UCC, Roisin Queen. It's an open day we held at Cork Public Museum a couple of years ago. And it's Roisin talking about archaeozoology to again a younger member of society there. That's a valuable engagement with the people in question. It's not a value, it's not an engagement that we can easily capture the metrics of. As I said in my last talk, the young person in question here may be briefly distracted by Roisin talking about animal bones. Perhaps that young person goes away and decides she wants to become an archaeozoologist. Perhaps it's discussed over dinner that night. Perhaps she's bored by it and perhaps she forgets as soon as she walks away. But perhaps we need to think about this, and perhaps we need to celebrate that idea. Perhaps that's something that is important to our practice. I don't think it's something we should shy away from. And to be quite honest, I don't know whether we always tie ourselves back into frameworks of value by these sorts of engagements, and one could argue that. But I don't think we should be scared of those forms of value and those forms of public engagement. Particularly, as I said in my talk, what is wrong with our work being distractions, and I mean distraction in a good way. So to perhaps move against ideas of being constantly on treadmills and constantly justifying our existence. Is archaeology useful? Is environmental archaeology useful? These things can exist alongside different articulations of value. And I think this is perhaps something that it will be useful for us to reflect on and discuss further. Susie.
Thanks for that. So what really Ben and I have outlined here is different views of environmental archaeologists looking outwards at how the practice and discipline of environmental archaeology can potentially benefit the wider world or have value beyond intrinsic value. But what I'd like to try and do with the rest of the talk now is to do some navel gazing. And for anyone who's not familiar with that term, it's really being a little bit self-indulgent and looking really to contemplate things about us and how we work really at the expense of the wider view. And we'll come back to the wider view at the end. So what I'd like to cast now is, what do we value as individuals and as a collective, as environmental archaeologists? And this could be a whole wealth of different things. It could be literal wealth. It could be prestige, position, material goods. They're all quite more capitalist ideals, but it could also be other things like community, health, peace, environment, adventure, simplicity. There's all sorts of things that as individuals we value. So really throughout this next bit, what I would like to ask you to do is to actually have a bit of a think about what's important to you. If anyone wants to share this in the chat, that would be fantastic, but really don't feel you have to. It can be just something that you mull over and think about yourself. I'm just going to talk a little bit now about me, do some navel gazing and just show you some of the values that are important to me, but more importantly, how they then translate into my work. So as Felix mentioned, I'm a palynologist. So one of the main things that drives me is curiosity. And I think that will probably be the same for a lot of archaeologists. And being able to look at new samples under the microscope all the time, that for me is absolutely fascinating. So that's why I do what I do. But alongside that, what I also value is the freedom to make up how I make up my own time. And I do make that up in very different ways. So I do work across the commercial sector, but I also work on a lot of volunteer projects, and I also work in the academic sector as well. I have an artist studio that I rent, which I've turned into a little mini lab, which is a big workspace. So for me, the sense of community comes in there as well, because I'm still part of a community, just not one that's around environmental archaeology or academia. It's also a very creative space too, and we'll come on to that in a bit. And it's also above what's called a scrap store. It's a reuse store where businesses donate anything that their waste products, and then people come in and then they can buy them. So we have all sorts of things in there, from plastic bottles to very nice paints and bits of paper, and it's a marvelous place for creativity really, and sustainability. So talking of sustainability, I would say that this is one of the things that actually kind of got me onto this thing about values in different parts of my life, because more recently, I suppose, I've tried to become a lot more sustainable in how I live my life, thinking about waste and recycling and where my food comes from. And I suddenly realized that whilst I was making this massive effort in my home life, what was I doing in my work life? I'm surrounded by single-use plastic in terms of sample bags. They're just everywhere. So bit by bit, I'm slowly trying to translate that into how I deal with the more commercial side of my work. So now, rather than sending off samples to the labs to be processed in plastic bags, I send them off in glass tubes. Rather than using brown plastic, I make sure I use a plant-based tape for sealing things up. There's lots of little things. So every little bit of my work, I'm going through and just trying to change all of those things, because actually I don't just leave my values at home when I go to work. I take those with me. And for me, that's quite important. Physical and mental health is also important. Otherwise, I can't work. I work with samples that come from a waterlogged condition, and actually being on water, the flip side of that, is hugely important to me. And seeing connections between things and making those connections is another thing that also makes me tick. Likewise, friendship. We often talk about the people we work with as co-workers or colleagues, but actually a lot of the people that I work with I would consider to be friends. And something that Ben and I have discussed a lot is that in order to work in a close collaboration with people and to be able to feel that you can open up your ideas and put something out there that might make you feel very vulnerable, requires you to be able to trust the people that you're working with. So for me, one thing that is very important is the trust of those colleagues that I work with. And that could be in an academic setting, or it could be in the commercial setting. And there's pictures there that represent all of those. And also Laura, who's an artist, who I also work in collaboration with too. Community, that's another side. Again, I've touched on it briefly, but I sat on the committee for the Association for Environmental Archaeology for, I think it was 4 years. And having that input into the wider community of environmental archaeology is also hugely important, that giving back. And I think creating a community that is supportive is actually really important. And this came up in the discussion after Christina's talk, where I think she said something along the lines of that she didn't have access to her thoughts in a hostile environment. And I thought that was an amazing way to put it. So yeah, having that supportive environment, I think is important both for individuals, but also for the discipline as a whole, really. And creativity too. So this is a picture of Redcar Beach, which is a commercial project that I've been involved with, both the field work of taking calls initially and then the analysis and the writing up of that. And that was a commercial project that was undertaken to, because you can't really see it in this photograph, but this building here, if you can see my mouse, the one with the kind of triangular roof, is a cinema that comes out onto the actual beach, and it is being, or it's now gone, it's been knocked down and there's a new one being put in its place. But also under this beach is a prehistoric submerged forest too, which was why I was there to take some calls. So that's been written up as a commercial project. But for me, if I just did that all the time, that's not enough really for me on an intellectual or even an emotional level, really. So what I've done with that site subsequently is I've taken that data and then I've written it up also in other ways too. So it's forming part of a chapter of a non-fiction book, but it's also formed a short piece which is in press at the moment, looking at it, looking at the wider implications of that, but written more creatively. So I think there's different ways that we can take these different values into all different realms of our life, really. But I just wanted to show really that this isn't just really about me. So Liz Pearson, who is an environmental archaeologist, she's an archaeobotanist, who also works within the commercial sector for Worcestershire archaeology. She's just written a book called Eat Like Your Ancestors. And she agreed to do a short chat with me this week. And so I've just got a film now of that chat of Liz talking about what she does and how her work and the values that she places in her life feed into each other. So let's see if we can get that to play. If there are any issues with this, please let me know. It should be playing in a second. And always about your values feeding into your work, but also your work feeding in some of that more creative and other space.
There is a lot of crossover, I think. Yeah, so I see what I do outside of my 9-to-5 work as still kind of work. It's productivity. You asked me earlier to explain the fact that I went down to 4 days a week in previous email, and that was years ago, back in 2005. And I did that because at the time I was suffering from post-viral fatigue syndrome, which is very like long COVID. And so I dropped down in hours. But then I found that my tendency to be a sort of a doer and a maker rose to the surface. And that's what I started doing with my time outside of work that we call spare time. So I put that in air quotes, spare time, as if that is something that's not as important as what we do in our 9-to-5 work. So, there I started growing my own food, picking up on all the making I tend to do, which people think of as hobbies like knitting, sewing, making my own clothes, repairing, mending, and then went deeper into it by learning to spin, to dye with plant materials. I've learned how to process flax. I've even been spinning with nettle fibers, so it gets a bit more hardcore crafter. And all those activities just grew over the years on that day and other days that I'm not an environmental archaeologist. And all that has fed back into my work, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose there must also, for me, it feels like that interest there, did that come from your work initially, the interest in fibres and the processing?
I think it's both something that I've always done. I'm one of these people who's been a knitter and a sewer since childhood. And I'll bet there'll be people in the audience who are too, who do all this. And so I just found myself following it back down the road of the processing further and further back. But I suppose the archaeology might have influenced me as well, because I'm looking at botanical remains of flax processing. So I think, oh, how do we find that waste? How does it occur? So I went on a course to learn how to do flax processing. And then you start to see, oh, yes, I see now why some of these assemblages I've been looking at are how they are. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there is this feedback mechanism from my work as an environmental archaeologist, my time outside, as I see it, being my own producer, my household economy, and just interests like processing flax.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I suppose coming on from that, I'm conscious that you've written your new book, and I just wondered how that also links in with these interests and your work as well, and how those two things meld together in that.
Yeah, well, the book is about sustainable food. And for a while before I started writing the book, I was one of these people who was blogging, and I was generally blogging about green living because that's one of my main interests. And so I'm looking at what the media is saying about it, what people on Facebook groups are saying about it. And I started to see that we can get very focused on the very worst of the present. So we get caught there. And one thing that I think triggered me thinking about it the most was seeing all these debates that go on about the fact that we're chopping down the Amazon rainforest to grow soya to feed to cattle and livestock in westernized countries like ours, but I think the States mainly. And the way that people were talking about it just made me think it really sounds like people believe that the only way you can feed livestock is by feeding them soya, as if we've forgotten that cows are out in the fields eating grass, eating hay in the winter, and that perhaps even the word hay meadow has dropped from our consciousness, if you see what I mean. So it's almost like the past is another country. And even it isn't the past, because farmers are still out there with their sheep and their cattle on the hillsides, grazing them on rough pasture and feeding them hay in winter. But it's almost like we've forgotten this. And I integrated some archaeology in there. So even though the book is really aimed at people who are more interested in green living lifestyle, if you like green lifestyle, that's the best way to express it. I'm using my knowledge and infiltrating that into the book.
Yeah, it's a lovely book. It's really, and I just love the way that they do weave together. And I think that's a really lovely example of, as you say, how your values and your work really kind of,
and getting other people to value communities in the past and the way that they've done things, the way they've thought about it. Hence the title is, I feel like I'm promoting Eat Like Your Ancestors, From the Ground Beneath Your Feet. Subtitle, A Sustainable Food Journey Around the English West Midlands.
I can ask, just thinking a little bit about your employment, was there any possibility of the book coming into your paid work in any way, or how much of support have you had for I suppose initially, and I know this is going back for quite a long time, but actually reducing work hours and having flexibility around how you work as well? I'm just thinking about the employment side of both the book and your lifestyle, really.
Well, I had good support for reducing my hours, and because I work for a county council, even though I'm paid through developer funds, if you see what I mean, they were good about that, and particularly because I, at the time I wasn't well. I'm fine now, so that was good. But as regards writing the book, I wouldn't be able to do that within my work time. I am paid to produce reports on developer-funded sites, which are mainly to discharge planning conditions, if that makes sense. And what I'm writing isn't that. So no, I couldn't have written that book within the remit of my job.
Yeah.
I have written a small number of blog posts where I try and bring in sustainability and concerns about climate change. And so I'm allowed a little bit of time in work to write those blog posts, but even then it has to be quite limited. Encouraging people to do some of this outside of their 9-to-5 work or study and use their work knowledge in ways that we're not used to doing, because we're used to writing academic reports or developer funded reports in my case, and we shouldn't see it as something less than.
Sorry, Susie, you're muted still.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was going to say, Liz kind of embodies a lot of these different types of work that we had at the start. She has this idea of defining it as proper work, but it's quite interesting that she kind of felt a need to do that. She had reduced her hours not for family reasons, but for her own personal reasons. I thought that was quite interesting too. But she's also looking at things in a more creative way. So she's got that idea of artistic work in there too, as well as the routine work of producing reports in this kind of day in, day out manner. So there was a lot of that. But the main thing, and I'll finish up fairly shortly, was that it brought back together this idea of the things that you, when you look inwards, the things that you value is often reflected outwards as well. And that comes across, I think, quite well in what Liz was saying, in that she wanted to get in this, the value of environmental archaeology for her, it was about trying to get that out and not just about trying to keep that inwards. So the two things, values and how something is valued by the outside world, they're not as clear cut, a bit like the work-life balance isn't, and a bit like nature and culture isn't. So I'll sum up now. So generally, I suppose the main points of what I've wanted to try and get over this afternoon is that we do live within a capitalist society, and hopefully that will change over time. But this is at the moment where most environmental archaeology takes place. However, as individuals, we do have agency. We don't have to take on everybody's values or capitalist values. But I think we do need to be clear about our own values and which ones we hold. Where possible, where we try to live our lives according to those values, it will tend to make work more rewarding and more sustainable, which comes back to the quote that I had up at the very start by Aristotle as well. And ultimately, we do reflect those values in our work, either consciously or subconsciously. So what I'd really like you to take away today is just to have a think about, as I say, what do you value, and do you take that into the different areas of your life? And this isn't to say that everything should always be in every bit of your life, but certainly for me, thinking about what areas I want to hold in my work life as an environmental archaeologist has been very important. And I think also as a wider group of people, actually, what does this mean for environmental archaeology, and maybe what values do we as environmental archaeologists hold, and how will these affect the future too? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, everybody.